for more now on the Trump-Putin summit. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Alexander Nekrassov. He's a former advisor to the Russian government. Here in the studio is Lester Munson. He's the vice president with BGR Group, a strategic consulting firm. From Miami, we're joined by Maxime Larive. He's a research associate at the EU Center of Excellence at the University of Miami. And Joel Rubin is the president of the Washington Strategy Group, a U.S. security consulting and lobbying firm right here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Joel, let me start with you. A much anticipated meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin, but we should remember that there were a lot of people in the United States who said that this meeting should not have even taken place, given these allegations of Russian interference, meddling, call it what you will. What did you make of today?
Well, Anand, it was shameful, it was a counterproductive meeting, but it is good that it took place because now, right there for all the world to see, we understand what Donald Trump as president is doing with Russia, which is he's essentially allowing Russia to dictate American foreign policy. And it's a problem because just on the heels of meetings with NATO, with the United Kingdom, where the president was very aggressive in his attacks against our closest allies, he then comes to meet with Vladimir Putin and essentially endorses President Putin's position on the election hacking of 2016. So Americans need to be wondering right now, after having witnessed this in full public view, about whether or not the president is standing up for them or if he's standing up for Russia.
When you say, Joel, that President Trump has allowed President Putin to dictate foreign policy, where has he allowed that to happen?
So the United States for years has been at loggerheads with Russia related to Europe and our relationship with NATO, relationship with the European Union, and ensuring that we have security and that we are protecting allies, for example, on the eastern flank of Europe. And it has been a goal of Vladimir Putin's to undermine and weaken that. And he has not been successful until now, where President Trump, as we saw last week, went to NATO and said to the NATO allies that maybe our commitment's not so firm. Maybe we're not going to be there for you. And he really undermined European confidence in American security guarantees. That's been a long-term objective of Vladimir Putin, and he is winning on that score.
Alexander, what was your reading of the summit today in Helsinki and that news conference that took place afterwards? Do you also feel that in some sense that President Trump allowed President Putin to dictate U.S. foreign policy?
Well, first of all, I think that nobody was expecting anything from that summit. It was just a get-together to know each other better. I think the press conference showed us that there was practically nothing decided. They just listed the main subjects they talked about, but we could see that nothing happened. I think the most amazing thing for the Russian journalists who were present there, and they told me about it, was the way the American journalists were expecting Trump to basically condemn himself and his election win. To say that, yes, the Russians were meddling, I told Putin about it, and so on. This was quite amazing for everyone on the Russian side, because Trump was never going to do that. Why should he say that? Is he going to delegitimize his own election like that? I personally don't understand what the American journalists were thinking about. And you know, we could see the aggression in their questions. I could feel that they were angry that something didn't happen that they were expecting to happen. And I must say another thing, and the Russian journalists also picked it up. You know, Robert Mueller can be doing his job and saying that he is objective and so on, but indicting these 12 Russians on the same day, on the 12th, you know, just days before this meeting between Trump and Putin, I'm sorry, that's politicizing. And that's another big issue that America and Britain, by the way, has. I mean, the governments there, the politicians, they have politicized their intelligence services. It started under Bush, it continued under Obama, and here it started under Blair, continued under Cameron, and even now under May. And this leads to what we're seeing now. They're playing games. And this is a very dangerous thing, because in the Soviet Union, we know what it leads to when you politicize intelligence services.
Okay.
So for people now to start saying that Trump should have said that, yes, you know, I made my position clear and this is unacceptable, this was never going to happen. And that's why we are very surprised
Okay.
in Russia that this is sort of getting out of hand, this reaction.
Joel, very quickly, give me a response to that.
Well, look, Russia invaded our democracy in 2016. There's no doubt about that. The American intelligence community has a unanimous view of that, and they are continuing to engage right now. Our Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, said recently that the red lights are blinking, that Russia is engaged. So the question about legitimacy of the elections is not about the legitimacy of Donald Trump. It's clear that we have to disaggregate that. We have to separate that. The question is about the legitimacy of American democracy. Now,
Right.
if the question is for President Trump, was there collusion or not? But he's conflating the two. We need to separate that and talk about the sanctity of American elections first. The other question comes at a different time.
Okay, Lester, one of the big issues that have been focused on here in the United States by the media was that question that President Trump was asked, whether he trusted his own intelligence or whether he believes President Putin. Let's listen to that part of the news conference.
Once again, President Trump mentioned the issue of the so-called interference of Russia in the American elections. And I had to reiterate things I said several times, including our personal contacts. The Russian state has never interfered and is not going to interfere with internal American affairs, including the election process.
So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
There's been outrage over that comment. In fact, the former director of the CIA, John Brennan, has accused the president of committing treason.
Yeah, I think Mr. Brennan's gone a little bit over the top in his reaction. It is an absurd thing to say that just because Vladimir Putin says something strongly, that means something. The man is lying. President Putin is lying. There's no question that Russia tried to interfere in U.S. elections and took many steps to do so. I agree with Joel that that doesn't necessarily impugn at all the validity of Donald Trump's election as president. And I think the president really ought to just let go of this issue entirely and say, I was legitimately elected, there was no collusion, but I'm very concerned about Russia interfering in our elections. That's the sensible thing to do. And the longer he goes down this path of denying Russian attacks on our electoral system, the more silly he seems.
Maxime, how is all of this news conference that we saw, the meeting that we saw in Helsinki, how is all of this being seen by European leaders, especially leaders like Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany?
Yeah, well, you know, I think for the Europeans in general, and in particular Chancellor Merkel or the French President Macron, even the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, really the narrative and the tension between, you know, the bloc and the United States really began a little bit before his election, right? On the campaign trail, he was very vocal against the European Union. He expressed on many occasions you know, his support for Brexit and thinking that was the right thing to do. So I think this is a continuation. I think the Europeans were quite prepared this time before the NATO summit after, you know, the recent debacle of the G7 summit in Canada, where, you know, I think they really get a sense that, okay, at this point, the President of the United States is quite serious in trying to divide the European Union, push his agenda. And therefore, you know, I think they're gonna have now to do a, you know, control of the relationship. And I think the response of the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, was, you know, saying a lot in a sense. Look, what matters to us is the relationship with the United States, and I think there is a distinction that's being made between the United States and the President of the United States.
Joel, on the question of whether this meeting should have taken place or not, I mean, we talked about that a moment ago, but, you know, as I said, there are people in the United States who say that he should not have met Vladimir Putin at this stage. The president has a very different view. Let's watch and see what he had to say.
I think that the United States has been foolish. I think we've all been foolish. We should have had this dialogue a long time ago, a long time, frankly, before I got to office. And I think we're all to blame. I think that the United States now has stepped forward along with Russia, and we're getting together, and we have a chance to do some great things, whether it's nuclear proliferation in terms of stopping. We have to do it. Ultimately, that's probably the most important thing that we can be working on.
Joel, the dialogue is long overdue. This should have taken place a long time ago.
Well, I don't know where he's been for the last 15 years because the dialogue has been taking place. President Obama cut a deal on nuclear weapons reduction with his predecessor, with Dmitry Medvedev, predecessor of President Putin. We had the reset in the Obama administration. President Bush, in his first year, said he looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes and saw his soul. So American presidents have gone through this rope-a-dope at the beginning of their terms, where they think they can fix the relationship that President Putin has somehow turned into a negative, and they could fix it. And then they find out through their terms that they can't. Now, President Trump, unfortunately, hasn't learned the lessons of his predecessors, and he's not really paying attention to the details, and that is problematic for American national security. It goes without saying that a 2-hour one-on-one meeting with the president of Russia should produce tangible outcomes. There needs to be clarity about what they discussed, and we do not know what they discussed, and that means that our agencies do not know what to do with whatever it is that they agreed to behind closed doors, and that's very damaging as well to our national security.
Alexander, what do you make of the significance, the diplomatic significance of this meeting and the kind of symbolism that we saw coming out of it?
Well, I think it's an opener. I think both leaders have stressed that they need to meet more, that this was the first meeting. They outlined the major issues that they want to discuss. I think Putin was pressing more on the Ukraine and on Syria, because these are two issues he's very interested in. Ukraine, I must tell you, is something that America basically destroyed any chance of relations with Russia, even not just improving. I think that Obama stands accused of bringing the world to a nuclear conflict. I mean, the Caribbean crisis was nothing compared to this one. And this has to be resolved. For Putin, this is the #1 issue. And I suspect that Trump at the moment, of course, is not going to go to any lengths to accommodate him. But at some point in the future, the West needs to understand the Crimean issue is closed. That is it. There will be no discussion about it. So either the West wants to deal with Russia, and there has to be some solution with Crimea staying Russian, or there will be a standoff, continued standoff. And of course, the issue of NATO spreading eastwards. This is a very sort of important point for Russia generally and for Putin as well, because this is the bone of contention. NATO promised many times, I mean the West, that NATO was not going to move eastwards. Not only now is it moving eastwards, it is moving even further if we consider that Georgia is now going to be joining NATO. So this issue is worrying not only Russia, by the way, and China and others as well. So this is one which is going to be very important. Nuclear weapons, obviously, and especially anti-ballistic missile systems, this is going to be there as well. But I think, you know, this is important for them to lay the groundwork. You know, people must understand that this is how this process goes on. You can't have an agreement at once, but you have to have these meetings that push these agreements.
Lester, do you think this is going to be the first of many meetings? Because we heard this sort of laundry list of issues, common issues that face the two countries, nuclear proliferation for one, cybercrime, terrorism, the war in Syria. So was this a good starting point?
Well, it is the starting point that we have. I think you know, we'll find out if it's not as bad as we think later, if progress is made on those issues. It doesn't appear to me that any progress has been made so far. A lot of these issues, President Trump's predecessor struggled with and struggled to come to any sort of common ground with Putin on these issues. He's got very different interests than the United States in Syria, in Ukraine, in other places. Even the way that Russia fights terrorism is not the same way the US fights terrorism. So the idea that by being nice and saying good things to President Putin in public is going to lead to some sort of good foreign policy outcome for the United States is not correct. What the US needs to do is take a very tough line with Russia. It should take a tough line in Ukraine. It should not stand for Russian annexation of Crimea or the parts of eastern Ukraine that Russia has illegally occupied. And it should meet force with force and be very tough with Vladimir Putin. At the end of the day, that's the only way you're going to get a real constructive response out of him, is probably by punching him in the face or kicking him in the knee.
Alexander, what do you make of that? The US has to be tough with Russia to get some kind of significant response.
Well, it's a silly idea, and I must tell you that the West and America primarily always forgets that what has happened in this century, you know, the war in Iraq, the destruction of Libya, the Afghanistan, the meddling and the coup in Ukraine, and so on and on and on. And it's always sort of being said that it's Russia, the aggressor. It's Russia that is moving westwards or something and trying to snatch territories. Russia has lost influence. America and the West have gained influence. NATO is now on the border with Russia and moving even more eastwards. So to say that Russia was the sort of the aggressor and the West was just standing there and watching in awe what Russia was doing, it's just not understanding the situation then. Living in some sort of a la-la land where things are happening and then you don't want to see how the real world works. And I think, by the way, the American media operates in this world of la-la land when it says something which it believes to be true, like, for example, that Ukraine has been invaded by Russia, which is a lie. It is a lie, because the whole crisis was provoked by the West. It nearly, as I said, led to a nuclear war. And it continues banging on with this lie and thinks that, oh, the world will accept it. Nobody will accept it. That's the point. You have to live in the real world and deal with the real issues. I don't see that happening in Western capitals at the moment. I see that mad liberalism and people, you know, not living in some fantasy world and not understanding the practical problems and how to resolve them. I think at least Trump has the, you know, the bravery to accept that the West makes mistakes.
Okay. Maxime, you know, we hear of the deep concerns that the United States has, you know, in its relationship with Russia over a number of issues. We hear of the concerns that Russia has with the United States. But for Europe, what are Europe's main concerns with Russia right now?
I mean, we have several main concerns about our relationship with Russia. You know, I think when we look at Ukraine, and I could go before, you know, I think it is very clear that the European Union tried to work on a trade deal with Ukraine, and this responded, and this triggered reaction coming from Moscow, and instability then in Ukraine that led to, you know, movement of troops from the east towards the eastern front of Ukraine, and then obviously the invasion of Crimea. For the Europeans, these you know, actions in Ukraine are kind of unacceptable. I mean, we are talking of 19th century geopolitical and invasion and you know, removal of sovereignty of states. And I think for the European, this is something that's really critical. Then, if we look at the recent, you know, poisoning occurring in the United Kingdom, I think the governments, I think that was approved by the US, the UK, and France, responded and said, look, it seems that you know, the Russian intelligence was behind this. We've seen movement of cyber attacks as well occurring in different elections. France, it was not very successful. And then I think the last point is we've seen as well, you know, financial support of extreme right and extreme left parties coming from, you know, a different shell bank financed by Russia. And this was the case of, for instance, the extreme right party of France, the Front National, that received, you know, funding from Russia. So I think for Europe, to sum up, it's really about affecting the values, affecting the instability, and ultimately, you know, undermining the union and the cooperation between 28 member states.
Okay, Joel, go ahead.
Well, as I was listening to our Russian colleague here, I couldn't help but think to myself that his complaints were about sovereign nations making their own decisions about how they wanted to proceed in the world. And many of them wanted to and want to align with the West and with the United States. And somehow NATO expansion eastward is a threat, but it's not NATO choosing to take over countries. It's these countries choosing to want to be aligned with NATO. And so this lack of respect for sovereignty and for other countries having the ability to chart their own course, that's deeply problematic. And President Obama as well did negotiate and speak with Vladimir Putin for many years about nuclear weapons. For example, after the New START agreement, he had sought a further reduction in nuclear weapons, and Vladimir Putin said no. And it was very controversial here for President Obama, who took a lot of heat from the Republican Party for seeking a further reduction. Vladimir Putin said, no, I'm not going to give up my nuclear weapons to the levels that you want, President Obama. And so it really just bespoke the lie of this idea of cooperation somehow requires American niceness.
But just on that point, President Obama also did approve a $1 trillion modernization of the U.S.
Yes,
nuclear arsenal.
and that is very critical within the Democratic Party, absolutely.
Which was never really fully funded, by the way. It was notionally approved, but not actually
It seems
fully
like
funded.
naive times, those debates here in Washington.
Lester, looking at all these issues that we've been talking about, is there danger here that they're going to be undermined, they're going to be overtaken by this continuing dispute over Russia's role in the U.S. election?
Well, it's certainly going to be with us through the American election in November and perhaps beyond. And I think the administration itself has a real differentiation between the things the president says and the things that his actual administration are doing. The administration itself, aside from the president, has actually taken very tough steps with Russia. There are some 460 different sanctions on Russian individuals and entities, many of them because of the cyber attacks on the United States election in 2016. You could look at any member of his cabinet, and he has a very impressive cabinet on national security issues. President Trump's closest aides will tell you Russia attacked the United States, and they want to do something about it, and they're going to prevent it from happening again. So the administration itself kind of needs to settle on where it wants to be. I would recommend that the president kind of adopt the view of his cabinet, frankly.
Alexander, one final issue I want to talk about, and that is the civil war that's going on in Syria. Russia, of course, is involved in that war on the side of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. Let's listen to what President Putin had to say about that.
As for Syria, the solution of the task to establish peace in this country could become an example of a successful joint work. Russia and US, of course, can take the leadership in this issue and organize cooperation on overcome the humanitarian crisis to help the refugees to come back home.
So, Alexander, are we going to see more cooperation between Russia and the United States on Syria?
Well, I think that on Syria, to be honest, America and Russia have been cooperating quite well, not on the diplomatic level, but on the military level. And I think that we should all be very grateful to the military of the two countries who have prevented the civil war in Syria spreading into the region. I think Israel has to be complimented as well, and some other countries, and Turkey and Iran and so on. And I think that technically they already have that mechanism when they are talking to each other, and we didn't really see any incidents because we do understand that there are two armies basically operating very close to each other.
Okay.
So I think it's going well. Let's put it this way.
All right,
I think there's a good potential.
Right, let me go to Maxime very quickly. Maxime, there was a YouGov poll that was published in Germany on the eve of this Helsinki summit. Germans were asked, who do you think is more dangerous, President Trump or President Putin? Who's more dangerous to the security of the world? 2/3 of Germans said President Trump.
Yeah, well, it's not surprising, when you follow the press closely and the recent, tough word coming from the president, and even his recently appointed ambassador to Germany, who, has mentioned that he was going to use his diplomatic post and politicize it in order to unite, the different extremes and the populist forces throughout Europe. And then, there is this tension when it comes to trade. Yeah. The whole trade dispute, I think, is directly affecting, the kind of the political and economic model of Germany, which is an export country. Right. For them, it's going to take some time to grasp, the change and the different forces happening. Yeah.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.